Next, on the 50s.
Roads to resources, how is it going to change the North?
It was a new frontier.
Moving people from dot A to dot B. They couldn't conceive of what the consequences of their actions would be.
Hello, I'm Holly Doan. You're watching The 50s, a special series on a remarkable decade in Canada. The Arctic, for centuries, was considered a wasteland. For the first time in the 1950s, Canada looked north. It became a romantic frontier of vast wealth that needed to be managed. It would never be the same again. Watch now as we present True North.
In 1951, the government offered a $1,000 prize for the best design of a new commemorative nickel. Canadians mailed in more than 10,000 entries. Among the finalists was an iconic image that captured the judge's imagination, a lone Inuit hunter. It depicted a way of life that was about to vanish. They called it the True North. It was as if southern Canadians suddenly became aware of the territory. One northerner said, "The Arctic is the center of the world, and we think it's the edge. But we're learning." Former Nunavut Commissioner Peter Ernick.
My house, the igloo, was my mansion. We had laughter. We had singing songs. We told Inuit legends. We told stories.
Go north, young man, the newspapers said. Ottawa forecast an Arctic boom. In the north, caribou and reindeer outnumbered people 10 to 1. Here, the government proposed to invest in railways, roads, and industry. The territories covered 1.5 million square miles, bigger than Western Europe. Geologist Robert Blackadar.
It was a blank on the map because there really wasn't very much known. There were, the map would show a nice pink color with all sorts of little dots showing port this and port that. But those were Hudson Bay posts for 3 people.
The Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, had a northern vision, he said. To look north was to capture faith in our future. Editor Clark Davey.
Dief saw himself as a visionary leader, and this was a vision he could take and run with as his own.
We will give to Canadians a vision of Canada's potential greatness, for which I find a yearning.
Dief was able to enunciate the fact that there are untold riches up there, there's sovereignty to be protected, and we need to get on and do something about it. And I think he struck a note with the Canadian people, with the electorate on that subject. I think it was a powerful, powerful campaign plan.
We will launch a crusade for the expansion of our country. We now look to the future in a great adventure.
Planners saw the future at a place called Frobisher Bay. Where there was only an airstrip and tundra, they would build a city of the space age. The Department of Public Works drew up plans for a northern utopia at Frobisher Bay. It was a domed city circled by skyscrapers with indoor parks and a swimming pool. The metropolis was to run on nuclear power. It was never built. Historian Robert Bothwell.
It was as if there was a kind of master plan of the North, and which had to be populated by dots. and you're moving people from dot A to dot B. And, the people who did this were not wicked people, but they were certainly, they did not think. They couldn't conceive of what the consequences of their actions would be.
They were sort of wrenched out of their homes and sent to the far north, I think, to build up a sovereignty movement in the north. I think the Inuit involved never forgave Canada for what was done to them in that regard.
Inuit were to be helped. They would be moved and schooled and trained to work for wages. In the 1950s, spending on aid programs for Inuit would double and double again. Former Member of Parliament, Peter Aitinuar.
The first English line I learned was from my dad when he first took me to school when I was 6 years old in Chesterfield Inlet at the Federal Day School there. And he said, if you see a white man, say, how are you?
How do we help the Eskimo consider tomorrow, to feel good about the future? How does he feel about his changing life? Well, let's ask him.
So the government wanted to look after us by giving us free things, free this, free that here and there, so that's why they moved us into a community.
Which would you rather be doing, hunting and trapping or working at the base?
I think better to hunt.
Hunting better. Do you get much chance to go out hunting now?
No.
Inuit were told where to live and how to work and even what to eat. One federal agency called the Northern diet unbalanced and prescribed vitamin-enriched bread. Inuit leader Mary Simon.
We have a word, it's called ilura. Iluramak is a word meaning that you're afraid or you're scared of challenging the person because they are in authority.
Northern society had remained unchanged for thousands of years. It was transformed within a decade. Later, a social worker wrote, "The people live in villages which they did not choose, in houses for which they did not ask." The government was considered well-meaning. The outcome was rated a tragedy.
I think they honestly believed that their values as a middle-class society were the best for the Inuit, as simply as that, no matter what the consequences were.
In 1954, the RCMP schooner St. Roch made the final voyage to her home port of Vancouver, the first vessel to sail the Northwest Passage in both directions. She'd carried the flag to the far north.
There was certainly no private expeditions. Nothing like today when you can look in the back of a magazine and see advertised, go to the Arctic for $4,500 next summer. That didn't exist.
The Arctic was so exotic, when Governor General Vincent Massey visited in 1956, he traveled with a newsreel crew. Massey, from Toronto, said, "In our childhood, we all had romantic notions of the North. The romance is lasting," he said.
People might consider it to be a hard life, but for us it was not a hard life. It was a normal life. And the contentment of being able to go out and get what you need from the land. There's a certain tranquility about that.
The tranquility of the North was deceptive. The land of ice was considered the first line of defense in the Cold War. Northerners were so close to the Soviet Union, one Yukon commissioner reported, residents got their news from Radio Moscow.
This is Radio Moscow. Here is a special announcement.
Newspaperman Arch McKenzie.
There was a listening post up at Inuvik where the Canadians monitored Soviet signals.
In the nation's schools, MPs were told Canada's own maps of the Arctic were not as good as the ones in the Soviet atlas. Amid fears the Russians were far ahead, the Geological Survey in 1953 assigned a team to Ellesmere Island. Their mission was so remote, they discovered artifacts left by polar explorer Robert Peary in 1906. Geologist Robert Blackadar.
But I was beginning to show the flag for the Canadian government. Look, we're doing these things with our Northern Territory. We don't just say we own it, we're doing something with it.
Experts calculated the shortest route for Soviet attackers to strike the United States was over the top of the world. Northern Canada was caught between two nuclear powers, like meat in a sandwich, one analyst said.
They truly feared the Red Hordes coming over the North Pole and attacking North America, which had some reality to it, I think.
Canadian snow troops and camouflage joined in war exercises in the far north. Soldiers trained to defend the nation from a Soviet invasion in the Yukon. In the remotest corners of the Arctic, Cold War planners proposed a more permanent defense system. It was a telecommunications network from Alaska to Baffin Island, the Dew Line. Newspaperman Bruce MacDonald.
There's not much in the way of resources that were being exploited. So the biggest activity going on there was the building of the Dew Line, distant early warning line. Warn us of the approach of Russian bombers.
The thickness of the ice must be tested for landing strips, and radio towers must withstand howling Arctic gales. On a tour of inspection of top-secret bases, U.S. Secretary of Defense Wilson is joined by Defense Minister Campney and Defense Production Minister C.D. Howe of Canada and other members of the Joint Commission. The vast undertaking will cost $500 million and take 2 years to complete. These watchdogs, stretching 3,000 miles across the Arctic, are the price North America must pay for security. They will sound the first alarm should an air attack come.
Americans built the Dew Line, paid for it, and initially ran it, though it was on Canadian soil. When a U.S. nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, traveled through Canadian waters beneath Arctic ice to the North Pole, Canada first learned of it at a news conference. Historian Robert Bothwell.
I think that was one of the things that made Canadians sensitive to Diefenbaker's notion of a northern vision. You know, if we don't do something with it, somebody's going to take it away from us.
On taking office in 1957, Diefenbaker told the country, "The North was our destiny," he said. Canadians were a northern people, he explained. The Prime Minister said, "Get outside in the cold and get busy." Alvin Hamilton, a former Saskatchewan school teacher, was Minister of Northern Affairs. Hamilton predicted Canadians someday would drive their cars to the Arctic Circle. New roads, he said, are the first faint lines on the blueprint.
When John Diefenbaker came along and he talked about roads to resources and all that sort of thing, but it never really focused that much. I mean, what was he going to do about it? How was it going to change the North? That was never really very clear.
In subarctic bush, 500 miles north of Winnipeg, they built an ore and nickel mining town. It was Thompson, Manitoba, a model of northern development. The suburb in the Muskeg grew to become the third largest city in Manitoba. In the Northwest Territories, a Depression-era shack town grew to a booming city. They called it Yellowknife. Gold miners could not have known their city would one day become the diamond capital of North America. In the Yukon, Diefenbaker became the first prime minister to visit the gold camps. He said, "Catch the vision of the kind of Canada this can be."
Was there one? I mean, it was not in the public, on the public circuit, you know. I can't recall much discussion about it until Diefenbaker, with his Northern Vision, came along.
It became a bonanza. Prospectors headed north to find gold and silver, lead and zinc, diamonds, and oil. The rush saw 180 million acres of oil leases auctioned by 1959.
We're prepared to spend money determining what the resources of our country are. So don't pretend that Canada is ignoring its north. And I suppose this was part of Diefenbaker's road to resources.
The North was pictured as a romantic frontier. Planners envisioned a kind of Arctic wonderland. The land was to be claimed and settled and made to pay its way with mines and cities. One MP said, in the North, Canada would lay the foundations for permanent and continuing prosperity. First, the country must address the people who already live there.
Culturally, it was important for my family and my extended family. They all partook of the meal from the first caribou I ever got, and it made me a very proud boy.
The Inuit numbered 10,000. They'd lived for centuries as nomads, hunting caribou and seal. They knew the country best, but would confront change none could have predicted.
As soon as I started going to school and as soon as I started getting into my teen years, I realized that there were a lot of changes happening in our own community. People were not living out on the land nearly as much as they did when I was a child.
The government proposed, it said, a transition from a life of trapping and hunting to regular wage employment. Men would receive vocational training. At the mission schools, children were taught an approved curriculum of arithmetic and the English language. There were new cooperatives to deal in furs and market fish and crafts. Mothers received the baby bonus.
Family allowances are paid to Eskimo mothers to supplement their income, which is derived from fur trapping. Eskimos are affectionate parents and use the family allowance wisely. Old age pensions and destitute rations are also paid to Eskimos through the police.
We understand it's well-meaning, but it's how they did it that's become a problem today. It's how the colonialism treated the Inuit, the Eskimo, that's become a problem today. If they would have come and discussed the issues like, we're going to have to move you to a community because this is what we're planning to offer you, then it would have been nicer, it would have been more appropriate. But how they did it, how they forced us to move into a community, that's the problem.
The Inuit posed another problem under federal law. They were not treaty Indians, yet they were not fully citizens. In 1951, Parliament passed a new Indian Act. A newspaper wrote, "The Indians' complaint is that their lives have been regimented." Under the law, treaty Indians could not vote or send children to schools of their own choosing. Under the law, said a Saskatchewan MP, Indians were left in a position of worship and the government with near tyrannical powers. British Columbian Frank Calder, the first Indian elected to any legislature in the country, reminded reporters, under the law, he could not have a drink at Government House. In Ottawa, the Minister of Citizenship, Jack Pickersgill, said, "We're responsible for our Indian brothers and sisters. But we can never return to the past," he said.
They still hold on to the...
A 1950 film depicted Aboriginals as colorful characters from the days of the pioneers.
And the Indians look upon the Mountie as a trusted friend. They know he guards their interests.
Those problems that we face, which are very serious, are rooted in those very policies that were supposed to make things better for us.
To make things better for Inuit, the government proposed an old policy: assimilation. It was a critical time, a newspaperman wrote. Canada must help the Inuit make a successful transition from the Stone Age.
The government took me to southern Canada to a place called Kitchener to work at a furniture factory. Can you imagine, here I am, born in an igloo, lived with my parents all this time. The only light and cooking light and heat that we had was Inuit oil lamp. Going into furniture factory, where you had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to work at a furniture factory.
Children were taken for schooling. One recalled, "We tried not to forget our language, but it was very difficult." Afterward, an Inuit elder was asked why the people did not speak up. He said, "Because the man in authority ordered it. There is nothing left to support our way of life."
I think the idea was that Inuit life was defective somehow, and it had to be bettered.
I have to say to you, that was the saddest time of my life. It was lonely. We were often punished. We were never going to be enough as long as we attended residential school. We were never going to be good enough for the colonialism of the government of Canada at that particular period of time.
In 1957, a federal agency reported, "The traditional relationship between Eskimos and their physical environment has ceased to exist." Inuit had traveled the land for millennia. Now they lived in the village and got an allowance. One wrote, "All these things we would have learned as Inuit, we lost." That's when the real alienation started.
Their parents were not asked. They certainly did not sign any consent forms. And it was a matter of fact, government coming up saying, "We're taking you and you and you to Ottawa for a little experiment. How would you like that? Isn't that great?"
The most immediate impact of Canada's discovery of the North was unforeseen. It was disastrous. Inuit with little exposure to the industrial South were swept by epidemics of flu and polio and typhoid in the 1950s. Nearly 10% of Inuit contracted tuberculosis and were sent far from home for treatment.
As soon as the white man came in, all the white diseases came in. And by the time I was there, tuberculosis was a deadly disease in the north. And every summer there'd be a large number of people evacuated to sanatoria, mainly around Hamilton. And a lot of those people, of course, never came back.
The painful experience is sometimes undescribable for them. Like they don't know how to describe it. It was so painful. I never recovered from it.
In 1950, staff at Hamilton's Mountain Sanitarium reported an incident. A tuberculosis patient named David wearing only and addressed from the grounds. Nurses recalled he seemed lonely. They found him weeks later. He had starved himself and lay down in the woods to die.
To this day, Inuit are still looking for their parents who died in southern Canada at sanatoriums. How would you feel if you don't know where your parents are buried?
The Coast Guard turns adventure at the top of the world into a routine mission as the icebreaker East Wind smashes her way northward carrying supplies to Alert, a Canadian-American weather station only 500 miles from the North Pole. Bulldozing through the pack ice amid towering glaciers, strangely beautiful ice mountains, it's a routine mission but a rugged, grueling one. Coast Guard films show the ship's helicopters scouting out a path for the East Wind. Baffin Bay, its shores a mountain of ice, crevasses 75 feet wide, hundreds of feet deep, impassable barriers to any land travel. Powered by 6 engines, the East Wind forges ahead, but the pace is slow. Dense ice must be smashed through by brute force, and in 3 days, only 125 miles are covered. But it's a proud achievement for the Coast Guard cutter. No other ship has ever come this far north. Only 508 miles from latitude 0, the North Pole.